Still, we do know when we violate moral boundaries, and that is the reason we try to cover up these kinds of issues by creating myths that gloss over the reality. Israel is, understandably, no different when it presents itself as a victim of Arab aggression and intolerance. How accurate is this description? Let's see if it was true for the 1948 war, the war that was sparked by the creation of the Israeli state. The scripted view usually depicted Israel's David against the Arab Goliath. Certainly, a casual glance at a map of the area reinforced this view. A look at the comparative size of the populations, Arab versus Jewish, further cemented the image in the world's mind. But this leads one to look closer at the situation and ask, was Israel really defenseless? Were the Arab masses a serious threat? Things are never as they appear, and so the answer is a mixture of yes and no. To understand the situation a bit better, let's look at a couple of factors. The first factor is King Abdullah of Transjordan. While it can be said that Israel is indeed surrounded by a mass of Arabs, one needs also to recognize that the best trained and armed fighting force in the area was the Jordanian army, which had been trained by the British during World War II. They were considered a very serious threat to Israel. The question then is, how much of a threat was the Jordanian army under King Abdullah? He was not as much of a threat as it might first appear. He had formed secret agreements with Israel and limited his targets primarily to East Jerusalem and the West Bank. Even when he had been appointed the head of all the Arab forces, he kept his word and never attacked Israel proper. Additionally, one must consider troop size. Arab troop size at the onset of the war was estimated to be 23,000. For the Israelis, the number was approximately 40,000. Even given superior numbers on the Israeli side, Ben-Gurion's military advisors placed their chances for winning the war at only about even. Most of those advisors overestimated the size and the strength of the Arab forces. By war's end, Israeli forces numbered 108,300. Arab forces rose to about 55,000. So who was the actual Goliath in this encounter? The numbers and the results certainly suggest Israel. In the final analysis, was the threat real? It certainly must have seemed so at the time. The mere prospect of an Arab invasion would appear to threaten Israel's very existence. In addition, having no real knowledge of the true military capabilities of the enemy, Arab propaganda was probably taken quite literally. Add to this atmosphere of fear the antics of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, shown here opposite Adolf Hitler, and one has the strong basis for concern. He was known, through his radio broadcasts, to exhort the Arabs to arise as one man and fight for your sacred rights. Kill Jews wherever you find them. This pleases God, history, and religion. This saves your honor. God is with you. So, given this context, were the odds as lopsided as many Israelis probably thought? The answer is an unequivocal no. Psychologically, however, given what had occurred in Europe with the Holocaust, and the uncertain prospects inspired by Arab rants similar to that of the Grand Mufti, it is easy to see how one could feel very frightened by the possibility of impending disaster. Now let's look at the situation from the Palestinian perspective. They refer to the 1948 war as the Nakba, or the disaster. Over 700,000 Palestinians fled from their homes during this period. 400,000 of them left their homes before a shot was fired in the 1948 war, according to Jacqueline Rose, who mentioned this during an Intelligence Squared debate entitled "Zionism is the Real Enemy of the Jewish People." Those who fled from their homes ended up in refugee camps, where they remain some 60-plus years later. The Israeli government's explanation for this was simply that the Palestinians fled from their homes of their own volition. Not so, according to Alfred Lilienthal, author of The Zionist Connection. The reality was much different than the myth. There are two claims to be taken into consideration on this issue. The Israeli government's, which indicated that the Palestinians left because they were ordered to and were deliberately incited into panic by their own leaders, and the Palestinian perspective, which, as you imagine, was quite different. They charge that they were evicted at bayonet point and by panic that was deliberately created, stemming from both rumor and fact. Which one is accurate? The Israeli government's perspective or the Palestinians' view? With respect to the Palestinian perspective, there are two views. One generated by a group called the Israeli New Historians, with Benny Morris being a major source here. This group did pioneering research made possible by the opening up of Israeli archives. Their work undermined many of the Zionist myths heard in the scripted account of Israel's birth. A second explanation comes from the Palestinian historians as well as from one of the Israeli New Historians. The Palestinian historians include Walid Khalidi and Rashid Khalidi, and the Israeli New Historian is Ilan Pappé. The New Historians have presented a viewpoint suggesting around half of the Palestinians were purposely expelled by the Israeli army, though this was not a formal policy. Of course, that does not mean that it wasn't a welcome outcome. On the other hand, Walid Khalidi believes that the plan was in fact deliberate and formal, with the goal of expelling the Palestinians from their homes. So the question of whether or not they were expelled deliberately is a tough one to prove categorically. Nonetheless, it was readily accepted by some of the early Zionists that force would be necessary if other strategies did not work. We must recognize that in order to create a Jewish state, the majority would have to be Jewish. To put it another way, one cannot have a French state when the majority are British. So whether or not the policy was a formal one, it must have been music to Ben-Gurion's ears when he was informed of the flight of so many Palestinians.